You probably still remember that moment. An afternoon with the TV already on. Rocky and Bullwinkle had just ended. Then the familiar narrator's voice came in.
Once upon a time, many years...
The animation looked simple, the lines slightly off, the colours not smooth, but the voice was gentle like a grandfather telling a bedtime story. Back then, Fractured Fairy Tales felt like nothing more than a harmless joke for children. But the truth is fairy tales were never the point. In Fractured Fairy Tales, castles, princesses and magic are just a disguise. Beneath them is a show that was banned in some places for being too satirical of traditional values. It turns princesses into ticketed tourist attractions, brings contracts, copyrights and commercial greed into the fairy tale world, and even openly attacks power itself from kings to foolish, vain, easily manipulated leaders. Below are 30 dark secrets hidden for centuries behind Fractured Fairy Tales. And if this show was part of your childhood, leave a like before we begin. 30. An American cartoon not made in America. People often assume that an iconic American cartoon must have been produced in Hollywood. But Fractured Fairy Tales was not. Its animation was made at Gamma Productions in Mexico City, a studio many Hollywood outfits at the time deliberately avoided due to quality risks. The decision had nothing to do with creativity or artistic experimentation. It was simply about money. Television budgets didn't allow J. Ward Productions to animate domestically. Mexico was cheaper, faster, and sufficient to keep the show alive. The problem was that many artists at Gamma had never worked on American TV series. They weren't used to the fast production pace, American visual standards, or syncing mouth movements to English dialogue. The results are obvious on screen: stiff movement, crooked drawings, mismatched lip sync, and blatantly recycled backgrounds. J. Ward saw all of it and hated it. But here's the paradox. Those off-standard visuals didn't kill the show. Audiences ignored them. Because the writing was too sharp, the pacing too fast, and the satire too smart. And that, unintentionally, perfectly matched the spirit Fractured Fairy Tales wanted to convey. 29. A children's cartoon whose real humour was for adults. For children, Fractured Fairy Tales was just a series of silly stories, talkative characters, clumsy actions, and endings that didn't resemble familiar fairy tales. For adults, however, it was a carefully written satire. The show repeatedly used fairy tales to talk about politics, but cleverly enough that no one could shut it down. A prime example is The Pied Piper. In this version, the Piper isn't just a rat catcher. He becomes a political operator, eloquent, full of promises, celebrated while he's useful. Once the problem is solved, those in power immediately walk away, deny their commitments, and hide behind budgets and procedures. The shock isn't the Piper, it's the crowd. The people know the authorities broke their promise, yet they accept it because they're used to promises existing only during elections. No magic, no delayed justice, just a familiar political cycle: promise, exploit, then abandon. Children see a strange flute player. Adults see a political lesson broadcast as a children's cartoon. 28. A gentle narration, hiding dangerous content.
A long, long time ago, more than a year in fact, a little girl lived with her mother in a little house on the edge of a deep wood.
Edward Everett Horton was no ordinary voice actor. Born in 1886, he appeared in over 120 films before becoming the narrator of Fractured Fairy Tales. His voice carried the authority of classical Hollywood, calm, polite, trustworthy. More importantly, Horton wasn't playing a narrator. He was simply himself, an elderly gentleman speaking softly, creating an absolute sense of safety. And that safety was the key. When a gentle voice speaks, audiences lower their guard. They don't expect satire. They don't brace for the social stabs hidden in the wording. 27. Sleeping Beauty turned into a tourist attraction. In one Fractured Fairy Tales episode, Sleeping Beauty is no longer a romantic symbol. She becomes a sightseeing attraction. People line up, buy tickets, and stare at a sleeping princess like a roadside exhibit. This joke wasn't random. It was a direct jab at Disneyland, which had opened only a few years earlier and was commercializing fairy tales on an unprecedented scale. Fractured Fairy Tales didn't beat around the bush. It simply asked, if fairy tales have become products, why not sell tickets outright? This is a very adult kind of satire hidden inside children's animation. The princess isn't cursed by magic, but by the market. 26. Fairy tales were just a cover. From the start, Fractured Fairy Tales was never written to teach children that good deeds bring good fortune. Fairy tales were merely a familiar frame, allowing audiences to enter without suspicion. Once castles, princesses, and magic were accepted, viewers slowly realized the story inside wasn't meant for kids. In one episode, Rumpelstiltskin is no longer a mystical creature. He's a contract negotiator, arguing over clauses and profits. In another, Cinderella isn't saved by kindness, but by calculation and very worldly luck. Dialogue full of wordplay, literary parody, and social mockery flies over children's heads. But adults catch every bit of it. Fairy tales stop being simple moral lessons. They become storytelling tools for adults cleverly disguised to pass through children's television without obstruction. 25. Satirizing American consumer culture. In the world of Fractured Fairy Tales, nothing is sacred. Everything can be priced. In one version of Jack and the Beanstalk, the magic bean is no longer a miracle. It's a profit-generating asset to be exploited by whoever claims it first. Jack isn't a brave risk-taker, but a market speculator trying to seize an opportunity before someone else does. Magic is no longer free. Promises come with clauses. Happiness is tied to profit. The core elements of fairy tales' dreams, rewards, happy endings are dragged down to the ground level of consumer society. 24. 91 episodes and dozens of rebirths of the same fairy tale. Can you believe it? Fractured Fairy Tales produced a total of 91 episodes, with dozens of them, retelling the exact same fairy tale, changing only the perspective, adding crazier twists and flipping the ending upside down to keep poking at the audience. Beauty and the Beast was remade multiple times, but the most famous version is Cutie and the Beast, where the beauty is a vain, attractive woman, while the Beast is an ugly, shy prince, and in the end, she turns out to be the truly ugly one. Rumpelstiltskin was reimagined 3 or 4 different times each version, changing names, motives, and endings that grew increasingly absurd. Jay Ward and his team understood one thing: a good idea should be pushed as far as it can go. They weren't afraid of repetition. They used repetition itself to escalate the satire, making audiences feel both familiar and surprised, laughing harder each time at the show's relentless boldness. 23. Attacking power and kings. In Fractured Fairy Tales, kings are never noble. They are foolish, self-satisfied, and constantly making absurd decisions. Power is not respected. It is stripped bare. Those in authority are portrayed as exaggerated reflections of real-world leadership. They talk a lot, understand little, and are always convinced they are right. In one version of The Emperor's New Clothes, the Emperor isn't deceived by evil or magic, but by his own vanity and obsession with image. He trusts flattery over truth, a direct satire of leaders who survive on praise. By turning kings into jokes, the show delivers a simple but dangerous message: never assume that those with power are those who deserve it. 22. An outrageously expensive intro, dirt cheap content inside. One of the biggest paradoxes of Rocky and Bullwinkle lies in its opening. The intro sequence with its iconic music and eye-catching animation cost nearly $1 million, an absurd figure for television animation in 1959. Meanwhile, the animation inside each Fractured Fairy Tales segment was extremely economical: static backgrounds, minimal movement, and constant reuse of scenes. This contrast was no accident. The intro was lavishly produced to create an impression of prestige and credibility. It told audiences that this was a big, serious, trustworthy show. Once that polished shell had done its job, the content inside was free to mock, satirize, and break conventions with little suspicion from viewers. 21. A children's time slot to avoid backlash. Fractured Fairy Tales didn't end up in a children's time slot by accident. It was a perfect disguise. When a program is labelled for kids, society's guard automatically drops. No one scrutinises it closely. No one demands accountability for its content. Parents see animation and feel safe. Networks see animation and approve it more easily. As a result, jokes aimed at power commerce and media systems slipped through unchecked. Any criticism could be dismissed with a simple line, "It's just a cartoon." The children's time slot became a censorship blind spot. And inside that blind spot, Fractured Fairy Tales said things that, if aired in an adult time slot, would likely have caused immediate trouble. 20. Political comedy in disguise. All of this leads to one truth. Fractured Fairy Tales is not a fairy tale series. It is political comedy. Its structure resembles sketch comedy, short, sharp ending with a punch. But instead of a stage or prime time, it chose children's television. Instead of live actors, it used animation. Instead of direct statements, it borrowed fairy tales. That children's outer layer allowed the show to dodge censorship and social reaction. No one panicked because it's just a cartoon. Yet inside Fractured Fairy Tales was doing something television at the time rarely dared to do, using laughter to talk about power, money, and systems right in front of everyone. 19. General Mills was more than just a sponsor. General Mills didn't just fund Rocky and Bullwinkle, they held full US broadcast rights. That meant they controlled when the show aired, where it aired, and who could watch it. The reason lay at the breakfast table. By the late 1950s, cereal corporations realised a simple truth: children decide the family's breakfast. Whoever controlled children's TV time could influence consumer behaviour. Children's television became a soft battlefield, and Fractured Fairy Tales existed within that system, a social satire sustained by the very social machine it was dissecting. 18. When bad accidentally became a style. What many people associate most with Fractured Fairy Tales is its rough drawings, stiff visuals, and clumsy movement elements that irritated professionals but never stopped audiences from watching. The reason was the writing. The stories were fast, the dialogue sharp, the satire relentless. When the joke is strong enough, visuals become secondary. Over time, that very ugliness formed an identity. Fractured Fairy Tales looked nothing like Disney, not smooth, not glossy, not trying to be beautiful. The cheap visuals unintentionally matched the mocking spirit of the content. The animation didn't undermine the show, it made it look exactly like what it was saying. 17. Edward Everett Horton never knew he became the voice of childhood. Edward Everett Horton died in 1970, just 6 years after Fractured Fairy Tales ended its original run. At that time, the show was only beginning to be widely rerun on television. Horton didn't live long enough to see the most important outcome: his voice gradually becoming part of many generations' childhood memories. To him, it was simply a late career job, telling odd little stories for television. He couldn't have known that countless children would grow up hearing "Once Upon a Time." spoken in his voice, and carry that sound with them for life. A quiet irony, the man who created the greatest sense of familiarity never knew just how familiar he had become. 16. The woman carrying almost the entire fairy tale world. June Foray was the quiet soul of fractured fairy tales. She didn't just voice a few female characters, she voiced almost all of them. Princesses, witches, fairies, evil queens, talking animals, even the strangest minor roles. Within a single episode, June Foray could switch from an innocent princess to a biting witch, then into a chirping animal without audiences ever realizing it was the same person. No stardom, no spotlight. Just an actress working steadily, precisely, and bringing a warped fairy tale world to life. 15. Limited animation was not an artistic choice. The term limited animation sounds like a stylistic decision, but for fractured fairy tales, it was a necessity born of poverty. J. Ward Productions simply didn't have the money to produce smooth Disney-style animation, so shortcuts were unavoidable. Static backgrounds reused shots, characters moving only their mouths or hands. Everything existed to cut costs. The result was a show that looked more like a radio play illustrated with images than a traditional animated cartoon. But those limitations pushed the focus onto dialogue and narration. When visuals couldn't carry the weight, words had to work harder. And fractured fairy tales exploited that fact to the fullest. 14. No stars, no cameos, just a theatre troupe. Throughout its production, Fractured Fairy Tales never invited famous guest stars, no cameos to boost ratings, no big names for promotion, just a small group of familiar performers working repeatedly with the same shared spirit. The operation resembled a theatre troupe, more than a television assembly line. Everyone knew their role. Anyone could fill in when needed. If one person was unavailable, someone else, even a family member, could step in to read lines. That closed ecosystem created something rare tonal consistency. Fractured Fairy Tales didn't need stars to stand out. It relied on the chemistry of a small collective, and that's exactly what gave it longevity. 13. One episode, multiple worlds. When viewers turned on Rocky and Bullwinkle, they were never watching just one story. Each half-hour episode was a collection of segments, a cliffhanger from Rocky and Bullwinkle, a fractured fairy tale followed by Peabody's improbable history, or Dudley Do-Right. This structure wasn't accidental. It was designed to prevent boredom. If one segment didn't suit your taste, you only had to wait a few minutes, a new world would appear. Within that structure, Fractured Fairy Tales functioned as the most flexible piece. It didn't require continuity, didn't depend on the main storyline, and could experiment with every form of satire. That independence is precisely what made it more memorable than even the show's main characters. 12. From ABC to NBC, a rare leap. In the early 1960s, animated shows were usually tied to a single network for their entire lifespan. Rocky and Bullwinkle was different. After debuting on ABC in 1959, the show moved to NBC in 1961, an unusual move for animation at the time. The network switch made one thing clear: the show's commercial value was strong enough to spark competition between broadcasters. This was no longer an experimental program or a minor segment, it was content capable of holding an audience. Even as the parent show's title changed with the network, Fractured Fairy Tales remained intact. It wasn't repositioned or reworked. That proved the segment was strong enough to stand on its own, regardless of where it aired. 11. Confusing titles but a stable segment. For decades, American audiences struggled to answer a simple question: what show am I watching Rocky and his friends? The Bullwinkle Show. The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle and Friends. Syndication kept changing the title to suit different rerun eras, but amid that confusion, Fractured Fairy Tales retained a clear identity. Viewers didn't remember the parent show's name. They remembered the twisted fairy tales. The segment has its own IMDb listing its own episode catalogue and is often referenced as a standalone program. It stepped out of the shadow of its host show, a rare case where a side segment outlived and outshone the series that gave birth to it. 10. A format designed to hold attention spans. Today, people talk endlessly about short attention spans. Jay Ward solved that problem 60 years ago. The multi-segment structure of Rocky and Bullwinkle was an extremely effective viewer retention mechanism. Don't like Rocky? 2 minutes later, there's a fairy tale, not into Peabody. Another segment appears almost immediately. Each story was short, self-contained, and required no long-term commitment. Fractured Fairy Tales in particular ran for only about 5 minutes. Just enough to introduce an idea, deliver a twist and exit before viewers lost patience. This wasn't just entertainment. It was audience experience design, something television wouldn't properly name or theorize until decades later. 9. The creator hated the very thing that made the legend. Jay Ward was never truly satisfied with the animation in Fractured Fairy Tales. He saw flaws that audiences ignored, but he also understood one thing: he had no other choice. Television budgets were rigidly capped. If the show was going to survive, Ward had to accept a lower visual standard than he wanted. Instead of fighting the images, he poured all his energy into what he could control: the writing and the narration. That's why Fractured Fairy Tales sounds smarter than it looks. Ward accepted defeat on the visual front as long as the words won the battle. Ironically, that very compromise is what gave the show its longevity. Jay Ward hated the visuals, but because of that, the content became what people remembered. 8. When fairy tales stopped being sacred. In the world of Fractured Fairy Tales, no story is treated as sacred. Fairy tales are no longer collective memory or moral instruction. They are packaged, labelled and sold. Elements once considered holy, magic, love, happy endings are dragged down into modern life. There is no destiny, only transactions, no higher power, only self-interest. What matters is that the show doesn't do this in anger. It laughs. A cold, lucid laugh, one that understands consumer society perfectly. Fractured Fairy Tales doesn't destroy fairy tales. It simply points out that fairy tales had already been destroyed long before. 7. Some episodes were adapted into books. Fractured Fairy Tales didn't stop at television. Some of its stories were rewritten as books for younger readers, but surprisingly, their satirical spirit was never softened. A notable example is the 1997 collection edited by A.J. Jacobs's Fractured Fairy Tales. Rather than turning them into safe moral lessons, the printed versions preserved the inverted structure, selfish characters' endings that aren't happy in the traditional sense, and jokes children might miss, but adults catch immediately. The fact that these stories could leave the screen without having their irony scrubbed away proves that Fractured Fairy Tales was never just animation. It was a mode of storytelling flexible enough to exist on the page, yet still carrying the same message. Don't trust fairy tales just because they look harmless. 6. The central paradox of the entire show. This is the paradox that can't be ignored. Fractured Fairy Tales was funded by corporate money and constantly mocked corporations. A show sponsored by General Mills yet laughing at commercialism. A show airing on mass television yet ridiculing the media itself. A show selling cereal yet talking about how everything gets sold. Jay Ward and his team knew exactly where they stood. They didn't attack the system from the outside. They operated from within it, using its own resources to speak against it. 5. A small segment that gave birth to an entire series. Fractured Fairy Tales wasn't just joking around. Some of its characters had enough life to break out of the 5-minute format. The clearest example is the Frog Prince, who later became the centre of his own series, Hoppity Hooper. This was rare at the time. A side segment with no visual investment, no stars yet compelling enough to grow into a standalone show. It shows that the true strength of Fractured Fairy Tales lay not in form, but in ideas and character construction. It proves that those seemingly throwaway stories were actually a creative nursery where ideas strong enough could continue living beyond the very show that gave birth to them. 4. Fractured Fairy Tales gave birth to a genre. Before Fractured Fairy Tales, fairy tales were usually retold seriously with respect for the original versions. After it, everything changed. This program laid the foundation for the fairy tale parody genre. The method was clear. Take a familiar story, flip expectations, inject modern humour, and end with a lesson unlike the old ones. Princesses were no longer perfect. Heroes were no longer noble. Endings were no longer predictable. This wasn't about destroying fairy tales, it was about rereading them through adult eyes. And from that point on, fairy tales were never told the same way again. 3. A series banned in some places for being too satirical of traditional values. In some conservative areas of the United States, Fractured Fairy Tales was criticised and even restricted from airing for being seen as offensive to traditional values. Fairy tales, long regarded as celebrations of morality, order and authority, were turned into biting jokes. On-screen anachronisms were pushed to absurdity: princesses using telephones, princes driving cars, witches swiping credit cards. These weren't mistakes, they were deliberate. Fractured Fairy Tales shattered time to make one point clear: fairy tales do not exist outside reality. And that was precisely what made it uncomfortable for many people. 2. The later legacy. Films like Shrek and the generations that followed didn't appear out of nowhere. They walked a path that had already been cleared. A path where fairy tales were no longer pure, no longer innocent, and no longer told as stories meant only for children. Princesses have psychological issues. Villains have reasons. Happy endings come with irony. This wasn't ruining fairy tales. It was the natural outcome of the storytelling approach Fractured Fairy Tales pioneered. From that moment on, fairy tales became a place for society to look at itself. And once that mirror cracked, no one wanted to return to the original perfect image. 1. The most powerful figure never existed. Throughout its 5-year run, Fractured Fairy Tales and the entire Rocky and Bullwinkle universe credited one executive producer, Ponsonby Britt. He had a formal title. His credentials sounded entirely legitimate. And he never existed. Jay Ward and Bill Scott invented the name when networks demanded to know who held ultimate responsibility. No one checked. No one questioned it. A name that sounded official was enough. It was the perfect Connor show that constantly taught audiences not to trust authority while placing a fake authority right there in the credits year after year. The biggest joke of Fractured Fairy Tales wasn't in the stories themselves. It was this: all of us believed it was real. Perhaps the most unsettling thing about Fractured Fairy Tales isn't any single story within it. It's the fact that we watched it for years without realizing we were being teased. And if, after this video, you can never hear the phrase "once upon a time" the same way again, then the show's greatest joke has finally been completed. Which of these secrets impressed you the most? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share and subscribe so you won't miss future videos.